Thank you for joining me today. I'm Sarah Bates, Communications Director for the National Human Genome Research Institute. This year, 2023, marks 30 years since the start of the National Human Genome Research Institute's Intramural Research Program, also known as the Division of Intramural Research. This program is now one of the premier genomics research organizations in the world, with more than 50 investigators organized across 8 branches and centers, who are joined by hundreds of scientists, administrative professionals, and many trainees of different types. In only 30 years, the researchers and clinicians in the NHGRI Intramural Research Program, also known as IRP, have had many seminal contributions to the field of genetics and genomics, including identifying countless genes responsible for human genetic diseases, developing innovative technologies, and even helping to finally completely sequence the human genome. But I also know that the program has had many stages of growth over the last 30 years, often facing major challenges and encountering pivotal transitions. Throughout, the spirit of the program has consistently been one of great ambition and scientific audacity. You 4 have each led the program at various times over the last 30 years. In the position known as Scientific Director, that is, Director of the Division of Intramural Research. This is akin to a departmental chair at a university for any of you who are more familiar with academic structures. For the next couple of hours, we will have a candid and hopefully lively conversation that will tell some of the key behind-the-scenes stories of serving as Scientific Director of NHGRI's Intramural Research Program. A conversation that we hope will serve as a group oral history and that will commemorate the program's achievements in its first 30 years. Jeff Trent, Dr. Jeff Trent, you are the first founding scientific director, serving for roughly 9 years, standing up the program in 1993 in partnership with Dr. Francis Collins, who was then NHGRI director. Under your guidance, the program quickly became an internationally recognized program in human genetics and genomics research. Your leadership was greatly admired, so much so that the Institute now hosts the annual Jeffrey M. Trent Lecture each year in recognition of your seminal contributions as first scientific director. Dr. Eric Green, you became scientific director in 2002, serving for around 7 years after being recruited to the program in 1994. You are now, of course, NHGRI director. Under your leadership, the program broadened in its scientific areas and matured as it recruited yet more talented researchers. Dr. Dan Kastner, you were at the helm from 2011 to 2021, all the time maintaining a very busy genetics research lab and remaining an active clinician. You saw the program through the difficult U.S. federal budget sequestration in 2013, keeping the program at the forefront of research while undergoing significant belt tightening. Dr. Charles Rotimi, you're the current scientific director, assuming the leadership position during the COVID pandemic in 2021. In less than 2 years in the role, you've already seen the program through significant transitions and helped set some new directions focused on global health, genomic data science, and diversity. Here's the plan for the interview. I will ask each of you to start with a short summary of how you joined NHGRI and how you became scientific director, or SD for short. Then I'll dive into some details of particular stories, followed by lightning rounds of questions. We do have limited time, so there may be some interruptions to keep us going. Please be prepared for this. All right, now let's start with you, Jeff. If you could please kick us off by telling us how you were recruited to NHGRI as the founding scientific director. I've heard rumors that the story involves Francis Collins and a napkin.
It absolutely does, and delighted to be here. I will say in full disclosure to my colleagues here that I had breakfast with Francis this morning because 30 years of memory, we wanted to do a pressure test between the two of us to see whether we had any concurrence in what I'm going to say. So this is largely a synthesis of both my and Francis's thought, but take it for what it is. Really, it began in 1989. I was recruited to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor to fill the role of the deputy director for their cancer center, their comprehensive cancer center, but also to be in a endowed chair called the Maisel Chair, which had about 20 individuals. It was a newly established endowed professorship on the search committee. Among those 20 were Francis Collins and Dave Ginsburg, among others. And so when I was appointed to that position, I began working even more closely with Dr. Collins, who was a Hughes investigator alongside a number at the University of Michigan. So in 1990, Francis asked me, in part because I was familiar with NIH centers, to join him as the deputy director for the submission of a genome center grant that at that time through the National Center for Human Genome Research. And we were one of the 6 that got the first grant there at the University of Michigan for these centers. And that is really where we did work for 2 years until 1992, when at that time Jim Watson left federal service, and I'll leave that as a story in itself that was probably a good thing on both sides. And the search began under Shirley Tillman as the head of the search committee, and that started in April of '92. By May, they had offered the position to Dr. Collins, and he rejected it. He declined. And really over that next few months, we talked several times about it. He came back in November of that year, met with Bernadine Healy, who was the NIH director at the time, and Lance Leota, who was the deputy director for intramural research at the time before Dr. Gottesman, and was arm twisted enough that he made the decision to come, and he asked me if I would consider joining him as scientific director. And we sat at a restaurant in Ann Arbor called Olga's, just an old dive off of State Street in Huron. And of course, we didn't bring paper or anything. We just drew something out on napkins to piece together the branches, the labs, the core components. What would we need to start the first, if Dr. Healy was as good as her word, the first new intramural program in 20 years, and of any scale. So we pulled that together. I had a chance to meet with Dr. Healy, and it was still Dr. Leota at the time, but also Dr. Gottesman, who was the interim division director for NCHGR at the time, the National Center, before it became an institute. So anyway, we all agreed we would hold a Stonehouse meeting, and we would invite candidates that we hope might take each one of the branches or divisions, and help them with, we'd tell them, help us think about what this looks like, but of course we wanted to recruit them. And actually all but one that we sent an offer letter to accepted. It included Bob Nussbaum and Jennifer Puck. It included Dave Ledbetter, obviously Francis and myself. Actually, Les Biesecker and Barb were there, as well as a couple of other people from Michigan, Paul Meltzer and a few others. But anyway, we were able to get that started with a remarkable group of initial recruits as that began in 1993 and early 1994. In part, a lot of them came from the University of Michigan. Paul Liu, who's now your deputy director, Larry Brody, Dan Tagley, who's with NCATS, I believe now, and Paul Meltzer, who's still with National Cancer Institute. But we also recruited some new divisions after that initial wave. Mike Blaze, we really felt gene therapy would have a huge part in people like Dave DeBodine, who had been with Art Nienhaus, or Melissa Ashlock, who had been with Ron Crystal, also sort of in that framework. But up in the genetic epidemiology side with Alec and Joan Bailey Wilson. But up to that point, we're in 94 and we're in the new Human Genome Research Institute, and we've never recruited a genome scientist. I mean, even though I would argue Francis could, you could think of him as one, or me. And that's when the gentleman to my left, Eric Green, came up, and he was initially recruited into Dave Ledbetter's group. And what I can tell you from Francis's comments this morning is, it was a hard recruitment. He drove hard recruitment for he and Gabby around the package that he would want, which to us seemed very excessive, by the way, I might mention. But you can see that it's really paid off over time in an exceedingly positive way. So I think that gives you a little bit of sense of where that began, and the opportunity I had for nearly a decade to serve in this incredibly important role.
Jeff, there's been so many myths around that napkin, which was never produced, probably because it got discarded somewhere along the way. But by your memory, how much did what you and Francis jotted down on that napkin reflect the structure you put into place?
Yeah, I think it was extraordinarily similar. We joined in dialogue. Now remember, that was 30 years ago, where we had less of an ability to accomplish some of the things today that, functional genomics, all the exciting elements, spatial transcriptomics, whatever we want to do today was not even thought of. So much of what we did framed out work, but it was all based on the concept that we could use genomic information to make a difference in human health. And that mantra hasn't changed.
So Eric, maybe you could provide the other side of the recruitment story for you to start talking about your own origin story and how it overlaps.
Absolutely. So actually, my recruitment here in some ways, I always say, reflected a recruitment effort to bring me to University of Michigan by Francis that came up just a little bit short. But I had a very good situation at Washington University as a postdoctoral fellow, and when I working on the Genome Project through another funded center that was also like the one at Michigan, working on the Human Genome Project. But then I need to go out looking for a faculty position, and one of the few places I really looked at and took seriously was University of Michigan. Francis and I were collaborating already, so I already got to know him, and I went up for a visit, and I really liked it and thought possibility. Actually, I didn't meet with Jeff when I was out of town at the time, but I met with a lot of these other folks that really was in a great environment. Washington just made too good of an offer to turn down. There was a lot of reasons to stay there, so I did stay there. By the time I made that decision, the whole genome enterprise was in flux because of Jim Watson's departure. Michael Gottesman was the acting center director, and there was some even issues locally at WashU, some problems within the Genome Center that actually required Michael Gottesman to get involved. So I actually got to know him a little bit, even as an investigator. But then there was, behind the scenes, I had no idea what was going to happen with the directorship of NCHGR, as it was called then. And then out of the clear blue, Francis called me one day and said, all right, I'm going to take the job. I'd heard some rumors that he was being recruited. So I'm going to take the job. I'm going to start an intramural program. Jeff Trent's going to be, the director. We have other people, some of you may know. I think even name drop Bob Nussbaum, who I knew well at that point, and Jennifer. Are you interested? Now, I guess I was a tough recruit, but I basically said hello almost immediately. I just said, this sounds great. I knew that I had been in the Midwest my whole life. Bethesda didn't scare me much. I mean, I always thought the DC area sounded wonderful. I didn't understand what the government was going to look like, but I was willing to take the plunge. And then it was just a matter of convincing as much of my lab to come with me. We were working on the Human Genome Project. I was very attached. I started my group. And so I probably drove a hard bargain. I guess everybody told me this. I swear I was a pussycat because I knew I was coming no matter what. But a lot of it was just to make sure I could bring all the people I wanted to bring. And I did bring a bunch. I brought like 6 or 7 people with me. And arrived on the scene. And the Ledbetter, I'd heard of this guy. And I remember, I don't know if it was Jeff or Francis, one of them said, look, we got to, because I was coming in mid-tenure track, we got to put you in a branch And we, everybody else has sort of been sorted in different ways. You could almost go anywhere you want. You got this pathology background. Ledbetter's talking about some diagnostic work. Maybe we'll stick you there. And sure, what the heck? And so I met David, and we've actually developed a lifelong friendship around it. And so that was great. And I came in and I toiled away and got tenure. And then when Ledbetter left, Jeff approached me about becoming the branch chief to take over. And I said, sure, I just want to rename the branch, which I did. And then a year later, all of us, meaning Jeff and Francis and I and some others, said, we've got to build a sequencing center here. And just very typical of this intramural program. Incredible support from top to bottom. We got Varmus behind us. Francis, Jeff were totally on board, and they created this thing. I founded it, and we've just celebrated the 25th anniversary of that, and it's been very, very successful. And I was totally happy as could be, being an internal investigator, being a branch chief, working with Jeff, working with others, Bob, Jennifer, and some of the others that had come up in the system. But then Jeff decided he was going to depart. I actually sort of immediately assumed that someone like Bob Nussbaum would want to become the scientific director, but people like Bob and Jennifer immediately told me they were not interested. They thought I should do it. So at least some people sort of really encouraged me to apply. And that was very reassuring that some of my colleagues were really telling me, please apply, you should be the SD. So I applied and I got the position. And I think the handoff between Jeff and I went extremely well. Part of it was timing, which just worked out really well timing-wise. Part of it was I was already a branch chief, and part of it was because it was such a healthy enterprise. It just needed a good leader, and just took the baton, and the rest is history.
So what was it about what Jeff and Francis had built that really made you come to the program? So what was it about the intramural program uniquely that
why I was recruited
Yeah.
here? I think it was the same thing that attracted me to Michigan, at least theoretically. And it was very much a reflection of their vision of multidisciplinary things to build up around genomics. And in fact, their genome center, which was funded by the Human Genome, was very unique. It was the most different one, actually, when I think about the first. It wasn't about, I'm going to sequence and map this chromosome. It was much more about how to translate genomics into useful things in biomedical research, including improving human health. And the thing about WashU is we were a powerhouse in genomics and basic science. And I was a little skeptical it was ever going to reach across the street to the hospital. I just didn't feel that the path was there at WashU to make that happen. And to hook my wagon to Francis and Jeff and Bob Nussbaum and Jennifer, that just seemed like a dream come true kind of thing. And I felt very comfortable coming in as the genome guy. It was I and Nick Tricopoli. I've often joked that I don't know if the napkin said it or not, but there was a Noah's Ark approach of what Jeff and Francis did. It seemed like they wanted 2 of these and 2 of these and 2 of these, and sometimes they were 2 seniors, sometimes they were senior juniors, sometimes they were 2 juniors. Nick Tricopoli and I were just young frontline Human Genome Project people, and we came in, and Nick left after a few years. But it just was, and 2 gene therapy people. It just seemed like every time it turned around, and so What a much more heterogeneous family than what I saw was the potential for me at WashU, and it was time to move on. I'd gone there as an MD PhD student, and I'd gone all the way through residency, postdoc, junior faculty. It was time for a change.
When I think both Francis and I felt, we wanted somebody that was not somnambulent and going to take a lot of time to really dig into things. And Eric certainly met all of those criteria as, with NIST now having, that's 25 years. And again, some of that wasn't as trivial as you might think, because there was very little genomics on this campus, and the idea of doing something that would have a broad impact like NISC or CIDR, which got established, that would benefit both intramural and extramural, ultimately. Was anathema to what had previously been going on in the intramural program. So genome really helped, and certainly was led by a great deal of energy by Eric, which hasn't changed.
And the thing is, I believe, I wasn't in the negotiations, but knowing Francis, I think one of the things Francis said about the intramural program of NIH broadly, which was the reason why he wanted to create an NHGRI or an CHGR back then, intramural program, was the promise that a focused intramural program on genomics would be used as to seed a dissemination of genomics and genetics across the campus. And we're feeling that would not only be proactively needed, but there was probably needed even some catch-up in the genetics arena. And so that was always a promise. I don't think any of us had to be convinced that that was a bad thing. And I mean, Jeff could give example of how almost on day one, we started embracing very interactive ways to work with other institutes, to build bridges with other institutes, to get the genomic stuff out there, teaching, sharing stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, that continues to the present time. And you talk to anybody, and we do talk to, I think our intramural program has been widely regarded as being incredibly generous, altruistic, and really now everybody's doing genomics across the campus. And I think that's partially to the credit of Francis and Jeff and the early days to see it. And I think, but every SD since has embraced that in a very serious way.
Yeah, so it sounds like, or to steal a metaphor from you earlier, Eric, if we have the program in its infancy with Jeff, and then sort of in its childhood with you, and then it's moving into its adolescence with Dan, and it seems like really, Dan, during your time, genomics started to really broaden into the rest of NIH. Could you talk a little bit about your origin story as SD, and also I think you came on board right when there's a recession about to sort of set in, so we'll get to that in a few minutes, but if you could talk about how you were recruited and became SD first.
Yeah, so my story, I think one could consider sort of convergent evolution on campus. So I actually came to the NIH in 1985 as a rheumatology fellow. And during the early part of my rheumatology fellowship, one of the things that I really saw was that what we knew at that time with regard to immunology and rheumatology was not sufficient that we could actually come up with cogent hypotheses as to exactly how the diseases that we were dealing with worked. And then came the Genome Project, at least the infancy of the Genome Project. And it really caught me that this was an approach where we could cut through the Gordian knot of all of the problems in terms of understanding things in an unbiased, comprehensive way, and actually begin to understand what's going on with those diseases. And so it just happened that I had a patient with a disease called familial Mediterranean fever, which is a genetic disease that I got interested in trying to find the gene by positional cloning. At the time that I was doing that, there was no Genome Institute, no Center for Human Genome Research either. So I was learning how to do these techniques basically from friends in the Cancer Institute, actually, who were at least in part involved in some of the aspects of human gene mapping, a guy named Mike Dean, for example. So anyway, I was absolutely thrilled when Francis decided to come to the NIH campus and to set up an intramural program for genomics, because at that point I had mapped the gene for familial Mediterranean fever to chromosome 16. We had become sort of the mini genome project for that area of chromosome 16. And to have actually people who were interested in and expert at some of these techniques that we were needing to use in order to figure out where exactly the gene was, what exactly it was, what it was going to teach us about inflammation in general, that was like incredible, that we were actually going to have that opportunity on campus. And so I was, just absolutely ecstatic with the idea that we would have those possibilities for collaboration. And certainly I took advantage of that right away, collaborating with people like Paul Liu, Francis to some extent. Chandra was another person doing the physical mapping that was really instrumental in some of the stuff that we were doing. Eventually, I got hooked up with NISC, actually, as the Arthritis Institute representative for the governance body of the sequencing center. So I was just absolutely delighted when there was an NHGRI on campus. Fortunately, eventually we did find the gene that's mutated in familial Mediterranean fever in 1997. And it turned out to be, I was really lucky, it turned out to be exactly what we wanted, which is something that was like the Rosetta Stone to teach us about all sorts of different pathways of inflammation. And so all of a sudden, instead of having just this one disease gene, there was a family of disease genes that we were able to tap into, and a family of diseases. And so things just took off. It was really a thrilling experience during the time from 1997 to 2010, where we were finding new genes, we were finding causes for diseases, and the thing that was really incredible was that there were actually biologics that the biotech industry had developed for treating other things, not the diseases that we were working on. They didn't happen to work in those other diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, but they were targeting the molecules that turned out to be important in the pathways that we were studying. And so all of a sudden we had these sick kids, that at least in some cases, their prognosis was either that they were going to develop intellectual disability and blindness and deafness and die by the time that they were 20 or so years old, or they would be institutionalized. So to have an inhibitor of something like interleukin-1, which is one of the inflammatory mediators that we found was important in these diseases, give it to these kids, and now actually just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was at a meeting where one of the kids that we started on an IL-1 inhibitor back in 2002, he's now a graduate student in biochemistry. So it's just such an incredibly gratifying experience, and that was because of the miracles of genetics and genomics, in particular genomics. And so, in any case, I had this long relationship with, and very cordial relationship with the Genome Institute. Now, in fact, my career had advanced in the Arthritis Institute. That's where I was in the Arthritis Institute. I had become the clinical director of the Arthritis Institute. I actually had become Michael Gottesman's deputy, overseeing all clinical research on the NIH campus. So I was busy doing those kinds of things. Eric had just ascended to the role of director of the Genome Institute, and so the Institute was looking for a new scientific director, and the search committee contacted me asking me if I was interested in applying. Actually, at first I thought that I was happy enough where I was and I was just going to stay in that position, but Eric actually contacted me and asked me if I might want to just talk with him a little bit about it. Eric is a very, very convincing salesman, I'll tell you. And he invited me. Not only did we talk in his office about all of the different things that were possibilities, in the young adulthood of the Genome Institute, but he invited me out to Airlie House. There was a strategic planning meeting that was going on there. And so I just really thought, well, what the heck, if I don't do it now, when will I ever do such a thing as this? So I'll just go for it. And so, Eric convinced me to do it. And before you knew it, I had signed on the dotted line. There were some details that had to be worked out. It turned out that although I had just moved my lab up to the 10th floor of the ACRF building of the clinical center, right next door to Bill Gall's lab. So, it seemed like this was the perfect thing. It was a marriage made in heaven, where Bill Gall and I, the clinical director and the scientific director, would have our labs and offices right next door to each other. And then the villain, Dr. Steve Katz, who was a good friend of mine, the director of the Arthritis Institute, said, I can't possibly allow Dan to keep this space up on the 10th floor of the ACRF building because, I would be remiss in my responsibilities as the director of the Arthritis Institute. And so we're kicking Dan out of this space. And so Eric actually had to then, scrounge around campus and find, a place for me to move my lab. And it turned out to be in the sub basement of the clinical center. It was the only space in the clinical center that was available. And I remember taking one of my senior people in my lab down there, to look at it. And her remark was that, it looks like it's a bunker. It was just a big concrete shell at the time that we were looking at it. But we persevered, and it worked out, and the move happened, and I thought, well, this is great. I'm moving into an institute that's in its young adulthood. Everything is going to be great. There's all these opportunities, and then within a month of when I started, which was October 10th, October 10th, 2010, truly, astrologically determined, that this was going to happen. And then there was the election in the beginning of November. And all of a sudden, instead of our thinking about, all of these wonderful opportunities that we were going to have, we were thinking about, well, how are we possibly going to make it if they cut our budget by 5%, and the budgets had never been cut before, in the Institute before that. Well, I think we're going to get to that part of the story a little bit later. But anyway, it was really just quite a ride getting there, to the scientific directorship, and I have a lot to thank Eric for just calling me up and asking me, wouldn't I please just think about it a little bit more, and then doing the things that needed to be done to actually make it possible. So thank you, Eric.
Absolutely.
Well, it speaks to the appeal of the program that you accepted the sub basement lab space.
I think he actually took the job before we worked out the space.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it wasn't much of a choice. But I do want to point out it's not irony. I mean, one of the symbolic things that was wonderful about Dan's appointment was, again, this early promise of Collins and Trent that we're going to really start to build genetics and genomics across campus, that, after me, we reached to another institute to take somebody who you really weren't a card-carrying geneticist when you started here, but he became one and benefited by us, and transfer knowledge to the point that he could then come over and lead our whole operation. So I think it's part of what I think is so wonderful about our intramural program is how we've developed genetics and genomics more broadly across all of NIH's intramural program.
Yeah, and again, I think that it's a nice segue into middle age, maybe, or 30s. 30s, we're in our 30s, both of us, Charles. So I would love to hear how you picked up the baton from Dan, and essentially what really appealed to you to become scientific director next after Dan.
Yes, picking up the baton from Dan, I think it's an interesting story. But I want to start that my journey really started a long distance away from here. And I was born in Nigeria, where I did my undergraduate studies in biochemistry. I'm one of 6 siblings, and I came to the United States in 2002, straight to Mississippi, and that was the first time I also got on an aircraft, and it was the first time I saw snow in Gatwick Airport in London. And so my journey is pretty far. So every now and then when I'm sitting with a glass of something with my friends, I always say that where we are coming from is a distance from here. You better get your act together. So I graduated from University of Mississippi, and then UAB in Birmingham, where I did my Ph.D. in epidemiology and biostatistics. And I got my first job after my postdoc with Richard Cooper, who actually introduced me to epidemiology in the fullest sense of it, to be able to do research. He was while doing that work in different African ancestry populations in the Caribbean, West Africa, and of course in Maywood, Illinois, that I started to get the implication of looking at genetics. We were just interested in public health, in epidemiology, and we were able to document quite easily that when you consume a lot of salt and you have, your weight is above normal, and that you have less physical activity, that your blood pressure tends to rise with age. And we demonstrated that very well. But while doing that work in all of these communities, I realized and I came across families where people in their middle age had hypertension, just like their mom, their dad. And I started saying, oh, there must be something going on in these families, in a sense. And in Nigeria or Ghana, you don't say things like that because it looks like you're putting a cost on the family. So you have to find a clever way to think about familial aggregation of various diseases. But for me, it was my introduction to fully appreciate genetics that will kind of explain everything from salt and physical activity and things like that. So after that, I was invited by Georgia Dunstein to help establish the National Genome Center at Howard University, the College of Medicine at Howard University, and which I became the director subsequent years later. And I've really enjoyed myself there at Howard University. And there's no place on earth that I think has more legitimacy to look at the genetics of African ancestry populations like Howard University. So I was right at home, at that institution. But after 10 years, I wanted to move on. And I remember one evening I had a meeting with Francis Collins, and I said, I'm interested in moving forward. By then I was already interacting with Francis on our diabetes project. And Francis said, let's think about, have you thought about the Intramural Program? That was not even in my own, kind of thinking at all. And I said, no. I said I was thinking about Hopkins, Harvard, because I was actually offered a package to move my lab. And I said, let's think about how we can brainstorm on coming to the Intramural Program. I said, we have to be able to do genetics, genomics, and hair disparity. And I think Francis went to Eric and said, how do we bring this guy here? What do we build, to attract him to the NIH? And I think you guys also met with Zuhuni, who was the NIH director then. And to cut a long story short, it led to the founding of the Trans-NIH Center for Genomics and Hair Disparity, which when it was announced was well received, but also with some questions, because some people were very uncomfortable that we were going to be discussing hair disparity in the context of genetics, when most people know that it is due to social structures, that poor social structures that drive people towards poor health. But I explained that by saying, for me, genetics is a piece of the puzzle, and we need to understand it, and however small that piece is, we need to understand it. So that's how I moved my lab, from the from Howard University to the NIH Intramural Program, into a branch that was led by Jonah and Alec, there in terms of statistics and computational work. And I remember my first interaction when I was accepting the job was interacting with Ellie Ruffs. And, she was the one that actually guided me, even had to negotiate, what kind of salary are you going to ask for? I had no clue, and she still does that up to today. In fact, in terms of applying for the scientific director, position, she also said, oh, Charles, are you not going to apply? I said, no. And she said, are you serious? You're not going to apply? So I finally applied. A couple of other people called me, and I applied. So I'm glad I applied. But it was under Dan at the NIH that I actually blossomed. I worked directly under Eric because Eric was the scientific director when I came on board. He helped me to negotiate a very robust package that I still enjoy today for the center. And that is, for example, the increase of my budget is tied to the NIH increase, and my budget is really maintained by so-called PI managed budget. Those were fantastic negotiations that I didn't have any clue, but people like Eric and Francis and Ellen, helped to negotiate that work. And under Dan, I became a branch chief, which I really, really was surprised, to become. And it was also under Dan that he nominated me for the National Academy of Medicine, and I got it. We tried 4 or 5 times, and so he never gave up. And he said, even when I was ready to give up, God said, no, let's keep pushing. And then he also nominated me as the NIH Distinguished Investigator, which I also received. So you can see that I've had a fantastic support, starting from what he built, and Eric continues to build, and now I'm in a position. My major challenge is don't break it. It's an outstanding program, and we're going to maintain and continue to do fantastic work. I'm really, really excited to be the person leading this program and following the footsteps of these 3 gentlemen. Yes.
Well, I know Eric's already ready to do some show and tell here about it. So I love that story. So thank you, Charles. What I'm hearing here is like this incredible lineage from the beginning, from what you established, Jeff, through your recruitment, all the way to people who are having this profound impact on Charles today. Could you talk a little bit about what criteria you used, Jeff, when you were sketching out the initial idea for the people you wanted at the program? Because I feel like when it comes down to it, it's really the program, it's who the people are. And then I'd love, Eric, for you to do a little show and tell with some of the pictures that you have to highlight some of the stories from these people.
Yeah, so maybe 2 thoughts. One is to pick up on one that Dan talked about on space as we, and I'll just throw this story out there and then I'll answer your question. So at the table where the scientific directors meet every week, I guess, and Michael Gottesman's space now, a new deputy director. In 1993, in walked Michael Gottesman to say, okay, we've made a decision. There's a new NIH director coming. It's Harold Varmus, and he's going to direct the NIH. And I had the privilege of publishing a couple of papers with him and working with him, Michael Brown, in the past. And he looks around the table and he goes, the difference is, he wants a lab. He needs significant, really useful lab space. And I need someone here to volunteer for that. So I threw my hand up immediately. And I look around the room, there's 20 scientific directors around them. No one else came close to putting their hand up. So Harold was in Building 49. Our first one became sort of a feature. He certainly wasn't manageable from the standpoint of any scientific direction, but he was a great person on that. Okay, so I think in answer to your direct question of what were we looking for, I think it's sort of the Peter Drucker culture eats strategy for breakfast model, in which I do believe both Francis and I had a model in place that we wanted people who were willing to work outside of the more typical framework for academics that was very hierarchical. That it would be a great place for trainees, a great place for junior faculty, and it wouldn't have some of the accoutrements that would be assumed where there's really a division between leadership and those that are working every day. And we broke that down in all kinds of ways. We'll probably hear some damaging remarks about I set up every year we would have a talent show, and this was a very competitive group of people, and the idea was how do we bring some kind of unifying, but also how do we humanize people? I mean, Eric was a master at destroying my good name and character. He questioned everything, including my parentage, in a satirical way, of course. So we had all kinds of ways of expressing ourselves, the way emblematically it represented who we are. So Bob Nussbaum and Tony Winshaw Boris and Jennifer Pike, there's a 4-member quartet playing classical music. And then there's groups like mine that were, doing 50s dance things, or something, just a complete mess of the building together the framework for it. But I think it provided a framework. Francis and I ended every one singing for 9 years some song and I think it humanized again and gave an opportunity for people to really reflect and grow. So my feeling was, we started that with no less expectation that people had to be outstanding in what they do, but they didn't. There wasn't a lot of structure. I can tell you, I'm sure that Eric will tell you, I never once tried to scientifically direct his science as scientific director.
And was that really to foster more innovation?
Yeah, I think it did. Whether it was necessarily, I think that was the result of it, and I'd like to think it was by design, but I think in many regards it did just help people flourish without a lot of overt leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I really can't stress enough. We haven't even gotten into the retreats and some of the funny skits these weren't every week, by the way. This was once a year to put it in context.
Yeah.
But there was a spirit, that really spoke to the sort of a human spirit, a self-effacing. There was just a lot of humor, a lot of energy. It wasn't that we weren't serious. We absolutely were incredibly serious as scientists, but there was this secret sauce that I give Jeff a lot of credit for. I mean, making these skits almost mandatory or pressure, just because it just, humanized people, and it just sort of got them a little bit out of their element, and it made it a lot of fun. And I'm not sure I appreciated as much at the time of how important that really was for setting the tone. And we continue this to the present time, and we do it in different ways because we can't have retreats and things like that. But so much of my leadership of the Institute and the people that are helping lead the Institute all appreciate, humor goes a long way, lack of arrogance goes a long way, being down to earth, just a lot of that, really I think sort of epitomizes the Institute and really sets us apart. We are still unusual. All the institutes are not like this, all the instrument programs are not like this, and so forth.
Sort of unusually collaborative in a way.
Yeah, unusually collaborative and just not hierarchical, and just not, Jeff was one of these people, he would, anybody, and all of us, anybody could walk up to us and talk to us, meet with us. It could be a high school student, it could be a summer student, it could be a secretary, anything. We're just all very approachable, and I think that sort of trickles down. So I think all the people at the Institute feel that anybody's approachable.
So I'll throw one thing in. Given a specific example, is that I had put together trying to look like BRCA1 or 2 for a hereditary high penetrant gene for prostate cancer. And we set up a group of about 30 called the Prostate Investigation Group. And of course, the acronym, we were the PIGS. And I remember at one of the scientific director meetings, I was called on that this is really just not appropriate for a place like the NIH to have something called PIGS, for this. So I came back to the next meeting having gone through a lot of. You can find some acronyms here if you really want to that are not intended, but so anyway, my point was, to be part of the PIGS was not something that you would do I doubt at Harvard or even at Hopkins, where I was a professor too. But so enough of that. But I think that's one of those examples, perhaps.
Right.
Speaking of animals, what about ducks? You want to say anything about ducks?
Not really.
Not really. We also we bent the rules a little bit. We used to have ducks, which was a way to blow
Not the
steam
animal.
on Fridays.
Not the animal.
No. No animals were hurt.
No.
No animals were hurt. But let's just say we do have
Not
have
even.
fun.
Well, so I
Yeah.
would love for you to have some examples
Well,
of
I
some
just
of
want
the
to,
team
before
building.
we move on from
Yeah.
this, because it's all fresh in our memory, is what we were like when we became scientific director. So I went back in our photo archives to try to find a photograph the best I could find of around the time that we became scientific director. And so, for Charles, it wasn't that long ago. For Dan, I'm looking at this, and I looked at him. Jeff looks a little older.
Yeah.
I look profoundly younger in this. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't have a gray hair. I have a baby face. You could just tell life has changed since 2000 and and 2. You look
The-
like
the
you
weight
look
of
a
responsibility.
little younger there. But not,
Yeah, quite a bit.
the weight of
Well, it's just
responsibility.
the lack of style in the clothing back
It's a
30
rather,
years ago.
Yeah,
So,
and then Dan looks the same.
yeah.
And Charles looks the same, but that's not fair because that was only a couple of years ago. Charles never
Charles-
anyway.
Not quite 2 years.
That's a very moment in time, though, with the mask.
Yeah, with that mask, you can't forget that
Uh,
period.
can't
right at the
forget,
height of
right.
the COVID pandemic.
Dan, you have a memory of that? That was 1 month after you became scientific director.
At the
At the
retreat.
Yeah, the last retreat.
Yeah, the
retreat.
last retreat, regrettably.
So, yeah. So you remember that.
Yes,
Do
I
you
do.
feel any older? Or do you feel less like the same as you were spunky then? You're spunky now?
I feel about the same.
Yeah.
I think it's very similar, very similar. Well, these are fantastic. Thank you, Eric. So it sounds like there was a very strong spirit of collegiality when it started, and then you started adding more and more members to the team, building that out, and then rapid growth through your period, right, Eric?
Budgetarily through Jeff. So remember,
Through
one of the
Jeff's.
things Jeff benefited from was, and then I benefited
Mm-hmm.
from to some extent, was the fact that when the Genome Project came under threat
Mm-hmm.
because of Celera and issues about should they continue, should it go to the private sector, blah, 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 and Francis convinced the US Congress to make it, we could go faster if we had more money. They gave the Institute more money,
Mm-hmm.
and the Intramural program got its cut. I mean, it was entitled to a certain percent of the budget, so when they didn't designate it, only had to go to the extramural Human Genome Project. So we benefited from that. And so really the greatest growth phase happened, especially near the end of the Genome Project, right when human sequencing started. And so all of us benefited tremendously sort of the last 2 or 3 years of your tenure as Jeff's tenure as scientific director from that growth.
So what are 1 or 2 examples of achievements that you were particularly proud of during that time?
Oh, I think that's one of the hardest parts to
choose.
because everything from, I mean, a little bit like Dan mentioned, some of the doors that are opened by the investigations. One is Bob Nussbaum's alpha-synuclein was even on the map, and these areas in Parkinson's and others were, there was, the progeria work of, Francis seemed to be able to find every gene he ever looked for every disease, that was an important component for what he did. There were, a number of different projects in the cancer area that gave hope that we would be able to refine and ultimately lead treatment decisions, even though, one of the reasons I left thinking that we would be able to work a little more closely with industry for alignment of some of those. But just, it was an extraordinary place. The number of genes for diseases that have been found by either NHGRI investigators or their participation with faculty across this institute at some point should be counted up, but it's just an extraordinary number. Maybe my most meaningful was we had a large group working on Niemann-Pick type C that, again, with a framework into other individuals here at the NIH. And I remember going to the press conference where we announced this with Ira Parsegian, a famous coach for Notre Dame, and his daughter or his son and daughter-in-law, Cindy Parsegian, and they had, their first child. They had 4 children. First did not have Niemann-Pick type C. The next 3 did, and they got to watch every single one of them die over the course of 9 or 10 years of age. And again, that's led, Larry Brody was involved, a number of other people have been involved.
Bill Pavin.
Bill Pavin did a lot of work on that and still does.
Yep.
And so there, very much as Dan mentioned, even for these extraordinarily difficult hereditary diseases, there's some hope, and part of it is going to come from here.
Yeah. So Boy, incredible challenges. So how did you transition to, so it sounds like at the beginning you had a very scrappy but extremely motivated group of scientists who joined. How did you start to build that into more of an infrastructure, Eric, during your time, especially as it relates to being on campus and lab design?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of things started to be built. Actually, they were mostly built under Jeff. I mean, I remember when I took over, feeling a little bit like Charles, gosh, don't break this. This is all going so well. I don't want to be the one to break the darn thing. But we still had enough resources and an incredible ability to be opportunistic to really just build on this. It was not fully built out because new opportunities were popping up. I mean, as an example, I think only a matter of months before Jeff departed, he successfully recruited Bill Gall as our new clinical director. Mm-hmm. And so this was a monumental recruitment and great opportunities. It was only a matter of a few years later that Bill came up with this idea of the Undiagnosed Diseases Program, blah, 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 and the rest is history there. So I've worked with Bill ever since on maintaining that and growing it, maintaining it, and thinking about it, sustaining it, so forth. I also inherited a search that Jeff had launched to get a bioethicist. Mm-hmm. And among the people that applied to it was a more senior person. That's what it was designed for, a social and behavioral researcher, someone named Colleen McBride. And I was so taken by what I thought she could bring to the program. And again, I had the resource. I said, not only did I want to bring her, but I wanted her to create a new branch, not just have a little pocket of bioethics. So we created the social and behavioral research branch. You already heard the story of, Francis coming to me and saying, this guy, Charles Rotimi, we got to bring him here. So, that was another opportunity. Or similarly, thinking about when Francis started to cook up chemical genomics, and Chris Austin was brought into his office, and eventually that led to the National Center for Chemical Genomics and a whole bunch of programs that eventually and we had to build this up within our intramural program, all with outside resources, so it wasn't costing us anything. And then eventually that got so successful it budded out and became its own center, National Center for Translational Sciences. So, so now there's so much, another success story. So, and I had to replace Jeff as a branch chief, brought Elaine Ostrander here, all new area of work. That was very exciting. So, I mean, to me, it was really rounding this out and building a more, it was a different life stage. But it was before we hit the wall. One thing I do want to say that I do think is important, if I think about the baton that I took versus the baton that I handed off, I think the one you couldn't deal with more striking contrast of when money was just wonderfully secure versus hitting the brick wall of sequestration. Is the one thing that we really needed was sort of a little more routine structure to account for money, so that when things got tight, we knew how to tighten it. It wasn't ever necessary, and it really wasn't even all that necessary when the first couple of years but I just could see it coming that, we're going to eventually grow into our clothes, and we're going to need to have a very organized and fair way to adjudicate resources, like most of the other intramural programs are facing already. So I think that's the one thing I built, working with Ellen Rolfes in particular. Initially Linda Adams was our head administrative officer, then it became Ellen. I mean, we really worked to just structure it. I used to joke, I think I've told Jeff this joke before, but I remember when I first became scientific director, of course, Jeff said he was leaving, months before he left. So there was a period of time where people just understandably stopped going to him. They just, all right, well, the new SD is appointed, I'm going to go to him, ask for this or that, or whoever it is. And I remember there was just all sorts of promise. People come in and say, well, Jeff promised me this, and Jeff told me I got that, blah, blah. I go, was it written down anywhere? And they would all say, he wrote it down on a sticky note. I didn't know he took notes. I don't know. I don't have those things. Sorry, let me look into it. And sure enough, one meeting after another, if I would go to that person's file and open it up, there'd be a sticky note. And it's like, should get 2 more postdocs within the next 2 years. Should probably buy this piece of equipment next year because I don't have the money. There are all these sticky notes that were all, and so I sometimes joke that I converted us from a sort of a sticky note, because that worked fine, but we converted it to something that was a little more formal, and we created documents so people really understood what their budgets were, so that when it was time to make hard decisions, what I was able to hand off to Dan eventually was very clear cut what everybody's resources were, what everybody's promises were. It was just much, it was like, adolescents, well, toddlers, they don't need much supervision. I just put more structure into early adult life so that when they became young adults, they dealt with real adult problems like budget shortages.
Yeah. Yeah. And how did you start to address that, Dan? What were some of your criteria when you had to prepare for a 5% budget cut?
Well, I'll tell you, really the most important thing at that point was to listen to what other people had to say. And once the election had happened and it was clear that maybe not immediately, but sometime in the next year or two, we were going to be up against this thing, sequestration, where we'd actually take a cut, then that really engendered quite a discussion amongst the whole faculty of the NHGRI. And certainly I had lots and lots of discussions with Eric about this, but also with the faculty members with regard to the question of how are we going to do this? Because the problem was that at least the model that we were working with, although it was well delineated in terms of what people had for their resources, it was structured according to a capitation model, meaning that people were assigned a certain number of staff members, and then based on that number of staff members, they would have a certain amount of financial resources, or maybe space as well, that was attached to that, but that was driven by the number of people that they had working for them. And the problem is that when you're needing to cut the budget, then you have to give people a little bit more freedom in terms of moving money between the personnel account and the discretionary spending account, vice versa, going back and forth, so that you can adjust things according to what your research needs actually are. And so we had to come up with a new way of doing budgets. It was still a way where things were written down, that's for sure, but instead of having a capitation model, we went to a bottom line budget model where people were assigned a certain amount of money, at least initially driven by the historical amounts of what the value was of their capitation model, but eventually then evolving into a model that would be, at least to some extent, driven by their reviews by the Board of Scientific Counselors. And so we developed a rating system for people, and then depending on what rating they had, they could either, of course it depended on what happened with the budget as to whether an outstanding rating would actually lead to an increase in funding or just you wouldn't get a cut in funding. And in some cases, that's actually what it was. But having a transparent, fair, peer-reviewed mechanism to determine people's resources was what ultimately we came up with. I mean, really, in some ways, the implications of what happened during that first 3 years or so rippled out to a whole bunch of other things. It certainly was the budget. It was how we did BSc reviews. It was recruitments, because instead of having branch-specific recruitments, because we had more limited resources, we had to have intramural program-wide recruitments. We did away with the retreat, not because there was anything, it was a wonderful thing. I really enjoyed it that 1 year that I had a chance to experience it, but there was a scandal out in Las Vegas or someplace.
Not involving NIH.
Right, but basically then there was a government-wide prohibition, for any sort of off-campus retreats or whatever. So, we had to reinvent ourselves in so many ways, but, to try to do it in such a way that we could still maintain the culture, the spirit, the animus of the intramural program that had been nurtured over, 17 years or something like that before I joined the Institute. That was the trick. And really it was a trick that involved input from lots and lots of people in order to get it right. And we didn't always get it exactly right at first, but at least we had an iterative process to make it right eventually.
Yeah. And how did that sort of, how did the integrity of the program carry over to your time? I know it's only been a couple of years, Charles, since you've stepped into the role. With this sort of stability provided, at least from Dan's time and Eric and Jeff, what are some of the main challenges that you face so far, particularly as it comes to, it's been 30 years since the program was established. There are a lot of people who are retiring, the Bailey Wilsons, Dave Bodine. There's a lot of people who are, moving on to the next phase of their life. What are some of the things that you've been focused on so far?
I would say where I am now, where our program is now, is really a combination of the phases that this gentleman just described. And so Jeff was a growth, Eric was a growth and stability, and Dan basically said we have to survive. And under very, very tough conditions. I remember when I first came and joined the NIH, Eric was the scientific director. He used to request from us just about every year to provide justification for a supplement. And we usually get it. But again, given the harsh conditions that Dan had to deal with, that just sort of, every now and then we may get it, but we were talking about cutting and cutting and cutting. And so when I became the scientific director, one of the things I told Eric and Ellen and Trish was, I don't want to hear the word cut. I just don't want to hear it, because I just felt like it's so depressing, and up to today, I really admire Dan, how he survived and guided us through that whole, phase. And so for me, our program, again, due to the fact that a lot of the people that were recruited, top-notch scientists by Jeff, Eric, and Francis, are now of age.
Yeah.
And so our program is really top-heavy when I became the scientific director. And just immediately, I think within 6 months or so, two very top scientists, retired.
Yeah.
And the third one, and so it was very immediately necessary to reorganize our structure, which is a branch structure and center structures. And that was one of the very first things I had to tackle. Appoint a new branch chief, get us to the point where we still have that feeling of some science uniformity and some collegiality and that combination. So that was really necessary. I knew I was going to do it, but I didn't know it was going to come that quickly, in a sense. So I'm still dealing with that consequence, and more people are going to retire. So right now, the challenge for me is how do I bring in new tenure track faculty into our own structure so that we can continue that wonderful energy that people like Jeff and Eric and others, started. So we have a challenge, and right now I'm in process of recruiting for a director for our newly established Center for Genomic Data Science, which we put together as part of the Blue Ribbon panel, which I think we can talk about, a little more. So for me, that is a real challenge in terms of being top heavy, and we need to start bringing in new investigators into our intramural program so that we don't go into a phase where we really don't have the early career and the very strong middle career, and of course the top, the top level. Whether it's basic science or a clinical program, we have to put an eye on all of that. And then also for me, a top priority is the issue of diversity. So when we look at our program, I say our institute should be a wonderful example on the NIH campus. We are extremely diverse when you look at our faculty, but we can do better. We can continue to challenge ourselves, whether it's from women or people from different ancestral background. So I'm very, very interested in that. I am also interested in making sure that we constantly engage at the global level in terms of genomics. As we deploy genomic medicine, that we are actually making sure that the gains accrue to all humanity, not just those that live in rich countries. So for me, It's a very important initiative, and that is why recently I established what some people call mini sabbatical, but I actually look at it as opportunity to go to where you would otherwise not go to, and see how people who don't have a lot of resources manage labs, so that when you get students from those structure into your lab, you are a little more patient with them.